Greetings, back again. This is your professor. Today we're going to be giving a brief overview of the two theories we're going to be introduced to. These are going to be two of the seven theories we're going to cover basically for the next few weeks in this class. Um, so you can find the theories here in Module 6, and they're going to be Afrocentricity and Afropessimism. Now, it's kind of a giving a brief overview. Now I saw a reference to a question about the term positionality, and again, positionality. I think I mentioned it in module 2 when we're talking about Du Bois is basically acknowledging kind of our relationship to the object of study. Um, and it's an attempt to basically to control for our biases at its for me it's its purest form. The way positionality is kind of used today within academic settings is to either to to acknowledge your relationship to whatever it is you're studying. So how does your background, how you see yourself in them, influence both either negatively or positively the how you're interpreting the object of your study. Now, again, I think at its purest, it's an attempt to control for our biases. But what happened in early social sciences and like anthropology and the humanities is that, as Winters expressed, this idea of man too and this universality of it, and how these ideas of whiteness imposed itself on imposed itself on others. So as white anthropologists, white scholars, sociologists were going into the field and studying non-Black people, their findings were at the time considered accurate or true or objective. Yet in hindsight, this idea of historical relativism, looking at the past through the present, there's also a concept of like cultural relativism, but it's how your bias, acknowledging the ways in which your bias is influencing, could potentially influence your interpretation of reality. So I hope that helps you there. So as we're approaching these two terms and these theories, this is going to be important, especially when it comes to Afro-pessimism and kind of the arguments being made by Dr. Frank Wilderson. So if you go into if you go into the module, I see I broke up each theory here, Afro-pessimist, and then the readings, and then the quiz for each. So Afro-pessimism, here's the reading. Let's click on it. It's going to bring you to the page, which is going to include a reading article. If you see if it's green, that means it's required material. So here's the reading, and then here's a YouTube, a video of Frank giving a lecture about the theory. I call him Frank because I actually refer to him as Uncle Frank. I did a project with Uncle Frank or Dr. Wilderson while I was a student at San Diego State, and you can find that here as well. But that's not required. So you want to do the reading and then the video. Both are going to help you kind of crystallize or kind of make sense of what Afrocentricity is up to. Now, on the table again, I just want to remind you that we're grappling with the question of the Negro problem. One, the invention of the Negro or the Black, within the context of European modernity, and how this has continued to evolve even post-slavery, when we're still seeing this violence being exacted against Black people. Again, and for what reasons, that's what we're trying to excavate. Now, Afro-pessimists is directly engaged with trying to tease out what's going on, why. So they have a very direct, straight to the point answer to this critique, to this phenomenon of Black, this Negro problem or Black continued, violence exacted against Black people. So Black deprivation, this humanity. Afrocentricity, as much, yes, it's a critique of the West, it is, but not so much in a direct way, because it's not. Afrocentricity is, it's the ontology there, this question of beingness, or the question of beingness is at the forefront of Afro-pessimist critique. What does it mean to exist? The question of existence itself. Afrocentricity is, it's, yes, it accepts this kind of myafa, again, the African Holocaust, as Black people begin, being forced into slave ships, into, moving on the ships, moving across the West. So this moment, this disruption of African beingness through when the Europeans arrived on the continent, or even before, um, when we'll see here, the African, the Islamic. There's a video I would normally share, slave to. I don't know if I'm going to be able to share this trade, but we see back in the fifth century, fifth and sixth centuries, this incursion began with Islam, with the Arabs invading Africa and subsequently converting the people that had their own understanding of themselves, separate and distinct from each other, but this conversion of thinking or thought around African people as Black and as slaves. And that, and how that, there's a book called African Holocaust for Dummies that describes in simple terms how that idea then was planted in the hearts and the minds of the European, as they then themselves voyaged into Africa, and they already had this idea of blackness being synonymous with slave, and they just picked up and ran with it, to the extent that it was worse or better or more robust. They're probably comparable. Um, they're probably comparable in terms of their dehumanization, degradation, and enslavement of Black people. The Islamic um, uh, slavery in Africa really centered around sex. So much of it was around sex, what we call sex trafficking today, and having concubines or people. So it was really focused and concentrated on the Black female body in terms of procuring sex slaves. But they also included men in converting them, converting the African males to Islam, and then becoming, soldiers as the Arab world kind of expanded itself even into Europe and Italy. There's some controversy around this and the idea of the Moors, and the implications of Black people, the Black Moors, uh, um, Black Moors, and how they were at the forefront oftentimes of Arab efforts into Europe. And so that is definitely there. But again, in terms of its origins, Islam being introduced to Africa was a form of colonization. What and the consequences also you'll find is and we'll kind of get to this, but in the civilizations that existed before, the implications for African civilizations as Islam spread through Africa, we see the effects thereof, where, again, similar to Christianity, I mean, it was a confrontation, the winners between this incursion, Islamic incursion, even if it's in blackface, with the traditional African civilizations as they understood themselves. We see this conflict, and ultimately the winner was the ones who had the superior military technologies. So here we see the transition from like the Ghanaian empires to the Songhai, and ultimately the Mali Empire. So this is the spread of Islam in Africa and the world. So there was, quick San Diego. Foundation report. So really quick, this again, in terms of this idea of outgroup, let's I just again using data to help kind of frame this argument as to why what this outgroup formation may look like today that's different than, let's say, the time of Jim Crow, or maybe different than slavery. Um, it's going to look different. And it's the role of the intellectual to kind of tease that out to be able to crystallize what this outgroup formation may possibly look like today. So I wanted to go to this article here. And having all these things up doesn't help. Let's see. So this foundation, San Diego Foundation released a report last year on racial and economic disparities here in San Diego. And some of the findings we probably could probably just guess, but so skimming through here, some things that stand out. So again, this is here locally, San Diego. How does race impact one's economic opportunities, basically? So this was published in October 2023. So again, contrary to what, this reputation of affluence here in San Diego, cost of living, housing prices, etc. There's severe economic disparities between those people. So what we'll find, this is kind of an overview. So this is but the demographics of San Diego. We see that the majority is definitely white and Latino here in San Diego. Black or African American people make up about 7% of the population. And that's a key number, 7%. So here, poverty in San Diego. We see, again, while Black people are 77% of the population, they're almost 19% of those living in poverty. That's about almost $14,500 per year, or for a family of four, $25,000. So 18 point, we're seven, Black people are 7% of the population, but 18.6% of those living in poverty. We see the poverty rates amongst other groups of people as well. So Black people are overrepresented in terms of poverty in San Diego. The next one, cost of living. Let's see, cost of living. So again, individuals living in households not making a self-sufficient wage in San Diego. We see again that's 45.8% of Black folks, 51% of Latinos, Latinas, and the white folks about 25.6%. So again, about half the populations of both brown and Black people are not making enough self-sufficient wage. Again, that's wage money to pay housing, gas, etc., except food. Let's see, next, housing. So this is households spending more than 30 or 50% of their incomes on housing, so rent or mortgages. So we see here that, again, this number, in terms of the number of folks who are spending upwards of 50% of their income on rent, we see this is Black people also overrepresented. So again, our incomes are low, but the cost of living is high. And this is why I say, brothers and sisters, y'all got to start looking out for each other and having some compassion, because it's a struggle out here. So if he or she takes you to Denny's or anywhere and is willing to pay for it, you better be grateful, unless you want to pay for something more expensive. Uh, so let's see. Again, youth in poverty. Overall, there's about 85,000 youth in poverty. Again, we have Black people overrepresented here. Unhoused students, so students who are, don't have are housing insecure. Um, Again, there's relative, Native populations and Black populations are outpacing other groups, with white students representing 1%. So how difficult, and some of y'all are probably experiencing this, you're trying to finish school, you're starting school, and here you go, you're housing insecure. So you're trying to figure out where you're going to sleep at night. How is that going to impact your studies? You know, so we can think about this in terms of, there's a correlation between how unhoused and success in school, in college. And so is that, is there, that may be a cause or a reason for you see disparities between different groups of people in terms of college success and degree attainment. Educational attainment. So again, 17.7% here in terms of Black folks without a high school diploma. Or again, only 7% of the population. Now, this is interesting. Again, expectation from adult educators. So the beliefs about educators about their students. So there's the students reporting low expectations by adults in high schools. Again, Black students higher, along with Native American students. Again, this lower expectations of, you know, of adults, teachers, counselors, etc. I know in my elementary school experience, nobody really talked about going to college. For me, one teacher said, if I continue to run track, that's going to be my ticket into college. But I had teachers let me go out and play sports rather than sitting there and do work. And I'd rather be outside playing, because I didn't necessarily feel engaged, or I didn't see the relevance in the curriculum. But this was elementary school. Elementary school is like the bedrock for future educational attainment. So I needed that's foundational. But my teachers would let me go out there and play PE with other classes rather than sit in there and do my studies. And partially part of that in my research, I found that biological males and females learn differently. There's differences, and we have to acknowledge those differences. And so the ways in which our classrooms are structured tend to, again, this is interpretation of reality to the extent that this is true, but if we say don't necessarily, are not designed with the differences between biological males and females in mind. So sitting down, we're talking about boys who are having this chemical production going on in their bodies, and you're telling them to sit down and shut up. What do you do with these chemicals as they're being generated in their bodies, into young adult, into puberty, but we're not acknowledging that. We're just telling the boys to sit down and be quiet. Not to mention the racial implications, because we know that Black children, particularly Black boys, are treated differently or seen differently by adults and their peers in elementary and even pre-elementary school settings. So low birth weight, this is going to definitely coincide with this idea you're going to find in Afropessimism. We're talking about birth. What is birthing, and this idea of children? What does that represent? if existence, how does existence, um, or one's existence, how is it, hang in the balance if we're not even caring for babies in the womb? So if we're disregarding, even our babies and life itself, how does one's existence hang in the balance? So it doesn't start when elementary school. This kind of disregard for Black life, begins even in the womb. And so when we have conversations about pro-life or pro-choice, we're not factoring in race and anti-Blackness and this paradox of the Negro problem into our discussions. We say, oh, it's either this or that. No, it's much more complicated to that when you talk about Black people. And I find most of these conversations about pro-life or pro-choice really reductive and unproductive when it comes to supporting Black people or understanding the Black experience. Just a couple more. Health insurance. Okay, this is relatively good. The Obamacare. If there's one thing he did well, maybe it was that. Um, Prisons, we already know about the mass incarceration. Prison industrial complex, where we see Black people well overrepresented in terms of incarceration rates, even in San Diego. Access to the internet. I mean, technology, we're transitioning to a technological age, not having access to the internet. Home ownership, again, in terms of what propelled the middle class white America into kind of this middle class status was home ownership at the end of World War II. But we see in San Diego, the proportion of Black people owning homes is far less than all other groups of people. White alone, 63% of white people own homes in San Diego. So who's taking this housing boom we've seen? Who's really benefiting from it? It's not Black people. And I think that would be it for now. Life expectancy, where Black people are expected to live 5 years less than white. Again, this idea of existence fringing. If on the front end, your existence is uncertain, on the back end as well, in terms of life expectancy. And this number is actually lower for Black males by far than any other group of people when you control for gender. It's generally true of females live longer than males. But for Black males, I think that number is even considerably lower, around 70, if I will remember correctly. But again, this existence lingering in the balance, is hanging in the balance. So with that, let me go back here. So when you think about the Negro problem, and these theories are going to tackle it in different ways. And there's going to also be tension and debate between the two. Now, it hasn't yet reached the masses in terms of the debates, but within the Black studies itself, it's like this unspoken elephant in the room. The implications for Afrocentricity, and it's not necessarily challenge to ontology, but saying how to Black life or the life of the African was disrupted through the Maafa, the African Holocaust. And now the impetus is to kind of reclaim this Africanness. Whereas, so not necessarily integrate into whiteness, because it's impossible into Western modernity, because within the terms of Western modernity, Blackness can exist in isolation of whiteness. But Afrocentricity say, yeah, we can, and the way to do so is to pick up kind of this an African sense of oneself. So this is where you saw, like in the 90s, people change, or even the 60s and 70s, people changing their names to African names, adopting African spiritualities, African languages. It's not as popular today as it was like in its height in the 1990s, but we do still see elements of this. We're trying to adopting or reclaiming this African past. Now, for the Afro pessimists, that those efforts for the Afro pessimists are going to be futile, because one, it's not necessarily because for Afro pessimism, ontology, regardless of its iteration, is a question mark. There's no true sense of self to reclaim with for Afro pessimists, and pessimism more generally in philosophy. That's kind of what they're getting at. There's no real true sense of self. And to attempt to reclaim a sense of self that's tied to some, pre-Myafa experience sounds good in theory, but in terms of practice, reality consists of two parts. Yes, the stories we tell ourselves to make meaning of our lives, but also that other part, that part, that story, that recognition. But the other part is the authority. So what's the evidence of one's authority to claim existence is the ability to defend itself. So even if we claim this is who we are, until Black people can defend that and protect that and then have others acknowledge and accept that reality, which is the definition of power, it's almost futile. And for Afro pessimism, even further because of the weight and scale of Western modernity, any claims to African or Black ontology only reinforces Black non-ontology. Because within Western modernity, and you'll tease this out more in the articles, but within Western modernity, Blackness is already assumed to be non-existent or the zone of non-being. Therefore, when you represent something, the more you represent something, the more it's made visible, the more you represent its the vision or the version or the definition of it within the current terms of those in power. So in order for X to exist, non-X has to exist. So you can't represent Blackness without representing it. It's also degradation and dehumanization. It's non-existence. So Afro-pessimism, although unlike Afrocentricity, which is grounded in one way about representation or representing Blackness, like a Wakanda film, Afro-pessimism is saying, though, yeah, you represent it, but it might look good and feel good, but ultimately it's also on the flip side, in terms of by representing it, you're also representing its disavow. You can't separate the two. Because when Blackness shows up, it's already disavowed, it's already degraded, it's already dehumanized. So it becomes an impossible paradox to escape from. But Afro-pessimism is challenging us to at least acknowledge that piece. So they are definitely in contention with one another. And that debate hasn't happened yet. That what were they called? Like during COVID, they had the R&B singers battling. Those battles haven't kind of made themselves public yet, but soon they will. And you'll get, in terms of your discussion, I'm going to ask you to do some of that kind of thinking around Afrocentricity and Afropessimism, and you're compare and contrast how the Afrocentricity and Afropessimism address this concept of identity for Black people. And that's where you can kind of tease out some of the debate that will ultimately happen. Now, what's happening is simmering, but hasn't reached full-scale debate yet. There's anything else I wanted to say? In terms of your critical reviews, please do not upload Google files. Copy and paste your responses into the text box. I mean, come on now, let's work with us all, please. Make life easier. It's already hard enough out here in these streets. So copy and paste your text or write directly into the discussion post Don't just post a Google link. Uh, let's see. Other than that, I think we're all set. All right. Good luck to you all.